Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the World War II Daily Podcast. Before anything else, please hit the subscribe button. It helps us a lot. It's for free. And if you change your mind, you can always unsubscribe and move on. You can find us on Instagram at World War II underscore daily and Samuel Dr. Corti. Samuel is not here tonight with us. He's traveling. So I'm going to do this interview by myself with my good friend Jenny Chen from the Pacific Atrocities Education for the second time here with us. Thank you very much again, Jenny, for joining us tonight
Yeah, thanks for
for a
having
second
me.
time. Yeah,
Yeah,
for a
and
second time.
where is Samuel off to right now?
He's in Switzerland.
Oh,
He,
expensive.
oh yeah, he goes to Switzerland every now and then. Yeah,
Why?
he bought he bought he bought me. I think his wife has family over there. Sometimes it's good when he goes because last time we met in Paris, he brought me some gifts from Switzerland and food from them from there is really good, especially
It's
chocolate. So
well, it's expensive. Switzerland, like chocolates are so expensive. Like, I remember hiking there, and I was like, "Wow, a hot dog is like $17."
$17 for a hot dog. Jeez. Oh my God. But yeah, anyways, Samuel's over there. So that's why I'm
Amazing.
doing it by myself. I know you introduced yourself already on episode 23. If you didn't watch this one, you can go there after this one and listen to Jenny talk about many other stuff like comfort women and other atrocities the Japanese committed in the Pacific during World War II. But I will invite you again to introduce yourself. Tell us what you're doing right now. What is your work? And then if you can brief us, like tell us the general, give us the general perspective of what Unit 731 is, because we're going to talk specifically about this unit tonight.
Yeah, so I am the co-founder of Pacific Atrocities Education, and currently we have an internship program that we're working on. So I lead like students who do research and whatnot this summer. It's a huge internship program over the summer. We also have YouTube Live happening every Tuesday at 9 a.m. So maybe if you can join us one day, but I know that you're pretty busy. You have a real day job, and so you might not join us. But we should record another episode together on my channel about Brazil in World War II. I've been looking at your stuff on Instagram. It's pretty interesting. And yeah, and Unit 731 was a secret biological and chemical warfare program by the Imperial Japanese Army during in Manchuria near Harbin during World War II. Actually, even before World War II, during occupation of China by the Japanese. And I believe Quinn has been here and explained how it started actually in 1931 or even before that. And so Unit 731 was basically under the leadership of Dr. Ishishiro, who was a scientist who convinced the emperor to invest in biological weapon because he read on the Geneva Convention that about biological weapon, and he thought, well, if biological weapons are so useful, then and that they need to write a whole set of rules on it, maybe I need to start investing in biological weapon, and Japan should invest in this biological weapon. And so he somehow convinced well, actually we know how he convinced the emperor. He, because of Russo-Japanese War, a bunch of like Japanese were dying from like unclean water. So then he made this water filter, and he peed in it, and he drank it in front of the emperor. To And the emperor was like a hobbyist biologist, and so he was super impressed and gave him money right away to start his lab. And his lab was in Japan, but then eventually he moved it to Manchuria because of the remote location and secrecy. And so he had he the lab conducted where he established this lab to conduct like human experimentation on civilians, prisoners of war, and like other captives. There were also like, because of how where the lab was located, and like in Manchuria was pretty close to Russia and Korea, they were also able to capture some of the Russians and the Koreans for Unit 731 as well. And the victims were like exposed to diseases, frostbites, and to see how human bodies react to like different diseases and frostbites. And also like he was doing his scientists, it's actually, it was a big compound, and they were doing vivisection and other experiments to help Japan develop biological weapons at the time. And so from his funding, you can see that Unit 731 was not just one rogue laboratory. It was part of a larger military system that kind of treated humans as raw material for war. And they even call the human victims like marutas, so logs, um, for experimentation.
Yeah, that's horrifying. I mean, I went to South Korea and visit Sodimon prison, where they also conducted some experimentation on people, but not to the scale of this Unit
But
731.
at
But
this
anyways,
time,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
but let's talk about that, right? Because actually, at this time, even though that like at a POW camp where they're not supposed to be conducting experiments, because of how much Ishishiro was getting funding from the emperor, that like all the doctors that were supposed to be just stationed for POW camps and whatnot, they got super into it because they were like, wow, we can become the next Ishishiro, we can become the next rich guy in our military and become a prominent scientist. So then everyone started being obsessed with human experimentation in this like era. And there was a lot of like literature that we find now that were like, oh, we did this human experimentation. Well, they don't say it explicitly, but they say it like, oh, we conducted research on a Manchurian monkey. But you can just guess what a Manchurian monkey was. It was just a human. And a lot of these like materials we have to piecemeal together because a lot of the records were destroyed or like disappeared on while in transit. So
And
yeah, it's
that was actually one of the questions I was going to make you, I think. Like how can you keep because we have like near like when you go to the western front of the war and you talk about the atrocities, people question a lot the documents. So how can you build like what actually happened when the Japanese not only destroyed, but there was also the geopolitics after the war that I mean like influenced a lot about like what
yeah.
actually happened.
Yeah, the geopolitical issue, of course, but like after the war, Ishishiro pretended that he died, and so then he even faked his own funeral and everything. But the CIA was actually able to find him. And like the communists were actually the one who ousted him. There were like a group of communists in Japan who like knew about these atrocities happening during World War II, and then they were writing to like the occupier of the of Japan at the time, who was the United States. And you can see like all these letters, and like figured out that he didn't die. And so then there were like all these interrogations of Ishishiro. There were also interrogation of like his top scientists, of and they were from like investigators from the United States. So it's not like just some rogue
Is
thing
it
that was.
public?
It was actually declassified in like the 1990s by Dianne Feinstein, the Dianne Feinstein bill. But there's still a lot of questions because like there are so many gaps of like the what had happened. And things are slowly being declassified still up to this day. And I was just reading from like there was an independent researcher who has been like obsessed with this topic as well, Jeff K. And he was saying that apparently there was an archive that they sent everything to in Japan because it wasn't being firebombed, and it was in like Niigata. And so now he's trying to get the Niigata archive. So there are things that are like from Unit 731 that are still being uh like exposed, and like found out to this day. We on our channel Pacific Front Untold, we actually interview one of the sons of like a guy who worked at Unit 1644, and he was saying that, oh, people think that I'm an expert in this field, but he had no idea what had happened. He only found like a bunch of pictures, and he realized that 1644 was one of the site that was also a part of Unit 731. And I think that like I think that was like one of your question of like what is the most misunderstood or oversimplified thing, is that Unit 731 was not like this isolated horror story. It was not like just some lab that was like just run by a rogue individual. It was like a much bigger story than that. It was like a state sanctioned, the emperor gave it money, as I was talking about. So, and it was a part of this military, scientific, and imperial system for science advancement. And it was connected to like this also this logic of like racial hierarchy, and to search for new weapons, and to believe that like certain lives could be sacrificed for military gain. Like and also it's not just like its own silo. It also had like links to facilities in Nanjing and Chengchun, which is like Unit 100, Unit 1644. And it's like, and I think that the public often remember it as like this shock value, but it's like, but they don't think about the system that allow it to happen. Like if you see Unit 731 as well, like in the the laboratory, the building that's remaining, you can see two chimney, and it's because that even like there were a lot of some scientists who actually die from doing human experimentation, like because sometimes the disease backfire and like contaminate them instead. And they believe that the Japanese should have their own incinerator, and the Chinese and Russians and Koreans should have their own incinerators because they don't want to commingle even in death. And if you look at like Kishi Nobusuke, like diary, Kishi Nobusuke was the guy who came up with like the economic policy for Manchuria, Manchukuo at the time. He actually like stated that Chinese people are like toilet water and Japanese are like clean water, and must not commingle the two. And if you see Unit 731 with the two incinerators, that fact becomes very obvious that even in death they don't want to commingle.
Oh my God, yeah. It's just yeah, it's very similar to Korea, right? They wanted to exterminate completely Korean culture, the Korean people, and yeah, make it
And
like
this racial hierarchy is so crazy to me too, because it's like in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, there was a guy who wrote like Japan must leave Asia, and then Japan started adopting more of the Western centric like clothing, and they see like kimono as being backward, and people don't wear like these kind of traditional clothing anymore. And
do you think do you think fascism is the key like to answer what actually happened
I think
to
so. And also like racial hierarchy is a lot of it that had to do with it, right? Because you can only start doing human experimentation so much on other people if you truly believe that another person's life is worth less than yours. If you start believing in some kind of racial hierarchy, then you can do more cruel things to other people than to your own, like if you believe that these are like your own class of people.
it is a question of morality, right? It shifts morality, and it's not wrong anymore to do that. But anyways, is that like when you're studying Unit 731, was there any testimonies or documents or cases in particular that changed your perspective, that were like a real change in perspective of what really happened there?
Yeah, that's a great question. There was a document about yellow fever. Naito was in New York in the 1930s trying to get a strand of yellow fever from the Rockefeller Institute, and the Rockefeller Institute was like shocked, and then was like notifying I think J. Edgar Hoover. at the time. And so the United States already knew that there was at least some kind of like biological research that was happening in Japan or whatnot. And then when I looked more into it, I didn't realize that at the time in the 1900s, Rockefeller Institute actually had hired a Japanese scientist to study yellow fever, and the guy ended up dying in Africa. And the guy is still today on Japanese 100 yen bills. And so if you think about it, right, he could be, I think it was 1,000 yen. He could be looking like Naito could have been looking at the way of how, like, okay, this Japanese scientist hero had done a whole ton of research of yellow fever. And so now here I am trying to get my Japanese hero work back to Japan, or like back onto what I'm working on in Unit 731. And Naito was like a crazy guy too, because if you think about it, Naito was the one who came up with like how to powderize anthrax. There was an interrogation that I was reading about of like how to powderize anthrax and whatnot. And okay, I finally remember the guy's name. I found him. Hideo Noguchi was the guy who like was researching like yellow fever at the time. Um, and so, and like this Unit 731 scientist was then trying to like get like his national heroes like guys like work. So you can see it as kind of like that, which is and like it provides so much context of like, you know, what was happening in these like scientists minds as well. It also kind of humanized them in a way, because of like, because you don't really think about these like historical people as like human sometimes. But then when you see it like that and like read these like documents about how they were trying to steal this yellow fever strand and whatnot, and then get the background story on it, it's like interesting. Yeah, this is the thousand yen that I was talking about. And the guy Hideo died in Africa actually working on yellow fever. And so they had like in during Meiji Restoration, they had this idea of leaving the East and joining the West, and whatever is Western is like supposed to be civilized. And so yeah, I just find it very interesting when I was reading about that.
You have movies like, just divagating a little bit, but just to show how what you're saying is true to people who like movies like Midway. At the beginning of the movie, you see American officers and Japanese officers doing like this exchange thing. They are, I don't know if they're training together. They're like in an event together. So, and they know each other like for years and years. So they've been working together before actually the war breaks out in Formula 1. Yeah. And like you said, the Americans, they knew there was something going on, but how? Like, I think it's two questions. One is how the Japanese could keep it in secret, besides of like the geographic position of the place, right? And did the Americans know what was going on before actually putting their hands, like taking over Japan and like actually getting the people who were working there?
Oh yeah, so Ishishiro actually, when he first started, when he got money and started, he actually started it in like Tokyo. But then he realized that if he stays in Tokyo, a ton of like Japanese Karens are going to find out what he's doing, and even though that he had like the emperor blessing, he's eventually going to get found out, or like, you know, popular opinion is going to drown him. So he then moved to like another lab that is like in Manchuria, but then he in like a soy sauce factory, but then people like escape his prisoners escaped while his guards were like hanging out drinking. And so then when he moved to like his final destination, Pingfon, he actually evicted the whole village of people. So then he could be the only, and there were like there was a train to bring him like his victims, and Quantum Army was actually the guys who would provide the muscle to like bring him the train of like his victims. And when you look at like how he also planned out this ping pong like mass, he of like his basically his village of human experimentation and like weapon production, he also had he also had his brother serve as the guard, because he can trust his brother more than he can trust some like random guards that would be drinking, so then his brother became like the head of like all the guards. And then so then you have geographical location isolation, right? And because it's a whole village, and then also Ishishiro's like top guard is basically his brother. And also there's like this language of public health, so it's operated under the disguise of like, oh, epidemic prevention of water purification. Who doesn't want to do that? Who doesn't want to purify water, right? And so it sounded more defensive and medical than, and in reality those kind of like, but in reality he was doing like research on like biological weapons and whatnot. And what is um and so you asked a very good question, like the US know. J. Edgar Hoover, besides like the Rockefeller Institute incident, he also had heard about Unit 731 at a party. According to one of the source document that I was going through, they were like, okay, J. Edgar Hoover actually heard about this at a party, that the Japanese are actually doing biological research on like and human experimentation. But I think that they were, and the investigators were already very prepared, very much so prepared to like deal with these scientists. And so then they were kind of maybe in their mind thinking like, okay, how do we get them the immunity deal? And also immediately Soviet Union was then the enemy, right? You don't want your enemy to somehow hear your trial in Tokyo and get this data for themselves. So then they were like, okay, we need to have some secrecy, so then the Soviet Union won't get the scientists. But what's also crazy about this whole thing is that the Soviet Union, because of like the Soviet Union basically destroyed the Quantum Army, right? And in the process also captured some Unit 731 scientists and brought them to trial. And the scientists at unit that they brought to trial, like I think they were released by like the 1950s. And when the Soviet Union was talking about it on the news and whatnot, the Western news was like, oh, this is just some kangaroo trial put together by communists, so don't believe them, blah blah blah. And but then it turned out that it was actually true, because in 1979 there was a Soviet uh biological weapons leak. So you can see that it was it was true that they did get some kind of anthrax technology and information from this trial, because how else would they be able to have a anthrax leak by 1979? Everything is very suspicious. And I think that why it's so important to learn about Unit 731 is that people are still doing this. Like even like so-called third world countries are probably trying to learn biological weapon techniques to kill people faster. And in a way, if you think about like military, and it was not like military generals who are like, okay, let's do like these experimentations on like biological weapons or nuclear or atomic weapons and whatnot, or like how to figure out poison gas and like have this so-called higher form of killing. It's always scientists, and like scientists trying to like make things more efficient in a way, and also like have this higher form of killing and convince the higher up to give them money to do so. It's not like your military general is approaching your country's leader on killing people on like, oh, how do we have a higher form of killing? And so then we have this question of debate of like, okay, what is science without ethics? in really. And I think especially living in the age of AI, we need to think about that, because there has to be a line that is drawn. It's not and, and I know that like Unit 731 and AI are very different topics, but they're all science advancement. And at what point do we cross the line? And these are like the questions that we should have.
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I feel like sometimes maybe I don't want to put myself into trouble, but when there's a state policy backing up some sort of investment in especially military science, things can get really out of control because the state has infinite money and it always has this system and machine working, saying, "Oh, we're just invested in health. We're just trying to understand what this bacteria does. We're not doing weapons, but who knows? Who really knows?"
Yeah, there's in San Francisco there was this episode of like that's called Operation Sea Spray. They were trying to learn how certain bacteria would affect people, and they found that San Francisco was actually the best place to do it because it would blow, and then they will see how far it can travel inland. And like I think like a handful of people end up dying, like 6 people end up dying. They were like, "Oh, but if we don't do it, the Soviets will come and do it, and we want to see if Soviets got their hand on this technology. How would that look like?" So it's like, okay, you're fighting the Soviets, but then you decided to use their technology to kill your own people instead of. You're like in terms, you're kind of acting like your own enemy.
Yeah, I'm going to say something polemic. I think sometimes the state just doesn't really care about the people. They just want to get their things going, their own agendas and own stuff. But yeah, I think it connects to my next question. Like, um, you talk before I say that, if you want to know everything about the quantum army that Jenny was talking about, the war guarding unit 731 and everything, episode 19, Quim Cho, Jenny's friend, and also a member of the Pacific Atrocities Education, right? I think his.
Yes.
And fantastic episode Samuel did with him. After this one, you can watch Jenny's, the last one, and you can also watch episode 19 with Quincho. So I'm gonna read what I wrote, so you can answer specifically what I want to ask you. One of the most controversial topics surrounding Unit 731 is the immunity granted to some personnel in exchange for scientific data after the war. Based on your research and what you know, how significant was this deal, and what ethical questions does it raise today? And before you answer, I think this is something I learned throughout these last couple of months studying World War II. I'm not a historian again, so I've been learning with historians and specialists that the context of the after war is very controversial. It's very complex. And most of the people who are engaged with World War II, they don't really understand what happened afterwards in Europe and in Japan. So, uh, what
Yeah.
ethical questions does it raise today? Like this,
Yeah,
forgiveness.
so the United States captured these documents and gave like couple $1 million to these scientists who were doing like very questionable like experiments, right? And today, if you say that, oh yeah, because we were trying to fight Soviet Union, it doesn't really age well because Soviet Union obviously is collapsed. um, and so then why were they trying so hard to do that? And it's so also such a significant question because okay, the United States was fighting Japan for 4 years, right? And then finally they were occupy it, and then actually in between the 2 weeks, like a lot could have happened in between the 2 weeks. They could have burned the documents. They could have already like tried to see what was actually happening. There's Jeff K was suggesting in his newest blog post that um that like they could have actually put their documents into like Niigata and then later transferred to the United States. So these 2 weeks, actually there are so many theories. At first I thought that they were just destroyed and the documents were just destroyed and whatnot, but then now there are like new theories that say that, oh, they could have actually just hid it somewhere else, and then so then that way they could have a stronger immunity case. But like I remember learning in like the Nuremberg trial, right? For example, when I was a kid and I was like, oh wow, all the bad guys from World War II are all gone, and it was fascist versus democracy. Democracy won. Um, and then after I realized that there were like immunity deals that were being dealt with like Unit 731 scientists or like other scientists who were working on these human experimentations and developing biological weapons lab, even though that it was against Geneva Convention, then the question really begins, like, did democracy really win against fascism? Right, because then there was no true trial in the Tokyo trial against these so-called fascists, right? And of course the data is valuable, especially when the Cold War was beginning. And so then the ethical question here is also like, can a government use knowledge gained through like torture and murder, and if it does, then what message does it send to like victims and scientists and like other future generations of their own people? And people need to realize that it was not just like a few weeks or a few months of like this deal with this immunity. It happened with like from 1945 to 1948. Like then happened with like Murray Sanders. Then there was another investigator. Then there was another investigator. Then they were like, I think Norbert Fell was actually the one who was like, oh, we need to give immunity deal to these people because there's not a way that they can do it. I mean, we can't do this kind of experimentation in real life anymore. In I think it was like the year of like 1946. They were like, we can't do that at peacetime in a Western country, and we all have like a code to abide by. And so then they spent like a couple $1 million to buy this experimentation from the scientists. And a lot of these scientists became like very prominent members too of society. They were like the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, that's Naito at Green Cross, right? And then there were also like they also became like politicians, a mayor, and no one really faced justice. It's okay. And so, but then they also give a questions of like, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, what if they didn't buy it? Then what would that have been? Right? Right? Like, okay, these people who die under like vivisection, then they die under for nothing. So is it better that it ended up in the hands of like other governments, or is it better, I don't know, or like could they have pursued justice in a way while they still taking the data? Would that be too much bullying? But then at the same time, they actually needed Japan to fight China and Soviet Union per se, right? So what is actually the better, like the best way to administer justice? I can't answer that question still.
especially because I think sometimes we when we discuss this event that happened almost 100 years ago, we're discussing them in a very privileged position because we have the information. We have the entire figure of what happened. But I think the people who were there, I don't know if they really understood like the consequences it would have in the future. Like you said, what would be the best approach? Is there a better way to fix all these problems, all these issues?
I don't know. But then it definitely, the immunity deal definitely turned like, all of these victims who were called Maruta or logs, like suffering into like a bargaining chip, right? That's like I think that's the problem that is still not healed yet. Like we were talking about it in our previous episode, that it creates this like historical memory scar. And like I think, there was a medical ethic review that I was reading about recently that stated that US officials discovered unethical human experimentation in both Germany and Japan, but the outcomes were like strikingly different. Like strikingly different. Nazi doctors were prosecuted and publicized. Like, we all know who Mengele was, while Japanese biological warfare perpetrators were protected. And like, I think in the 1980s they made a movie about like the men behind the rising sun, and I think that movie in Hong Kong was then heavily censored because they were just like, oh, this is not true, this is conspiracy theory, or like, you should not make light of such a subject or whatnot. But then like, turned out that like maybe 80% of the movie was true. So it is very strikingly different. And I think also we have this Western bias of like, because Japan is now for example, in 2026 they're now like so-called ally of the United States, right? So that it makes a huge difference in terms of like lens, a historical lens, that it becomes complicated.
Yeah, it's yeah. When I was as I have a very I'm close to Koreans, and man, some of my friends from Korea, they hate Japanese. They really hate Japanese because of the stories, because of his family, because of their families. I personally met a survivor who was in the resistance against Japanese um, in Japan. He was Korean, studying in Japan. He was helping the resistance. Um, but anyways, they still hate the Japanese because don't they didn't forget it. They didn't forget, right, what happened. And well, anyways, this actually brings us to the next question. If you want to know, like why do you think what the Japanese did is it remains last known internationally, and like how okay, I was talking about Korea, and it's obvious that in Korea they still go to protest every Wednesday in front of the embassy and all of that. But how is this in how well known is this in China and in other places in Asia? If you can answer that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that like, if you in Asia, people definitely know about it. They talk about it, and like, I think, and I want to also bring this point up about like two tier of like historical memory. So recently, the prime minister of Japan went to Australia and like bound and was bowing to a tomb of like this unknown soldier in from Australia. I think bombing of Darwin killed like 235 people. But what about the tens of millions of people that were killed in Asia, right? Like, is silence. They don't she's not going to bend her knees to Koreans, of these people in Korea. I don't think so. It's not happening. And like, even in the Philippines, in Manila, when they like erected a statue for comfort women, they were like, "Oh, take it down because Japan invests so much money in Manila in the Philippines, so you have to like take it down." But there she was in Australia, bowing down. And you can argue that because now they're like an alliance of and Australia is now in the alliance with Japan and whatnot. But isn't Korea also supposed to be in that alliance? Then why is she not going over to her neighbor? It's so close, right? It's like a couple hours of plane ride and you can already be there. But she decided to travel all the way to Australia to do that.
An
So
hour by
yeah,
plane.
yeah, it's just an hour by plane to go to Korea to do to do an apology. Then people can maybe not move on, but then like there's more historical healing. But then she decided to travel all the way to Australia to bend her knees. The the answer is very obvious about this racial hierarchy. And so it's a very divide. Then you remain very divided in terms of your historical memory. Like, I'm pretty sure there are like Japanese historians who actually were the first ones who did exhibitions on Unit 731 in Japan itself. And then like the Japanese Unit 731 workers were like then coming out to like actually talk about it. And NHK also made like this documentary who was talking about and unapologetically talking about Unit 731 and like what they were doing on the world. But then there are also like these there are a lot of like deniers, like I think it's political deniers, who would just like say, oh, it never happened, this is your channel is so biased because you're talking too much about Unit 731. And so it's just I think it's very divided still, but of course in places like China or like Korea or Philippines or like even Southeast Asia, they still remember about the Japanese atrocities that was happening in World War II. But I think that also internationally overall, like Unit 731 is still not widely understood. Like there was also a unit in Singapore that is like a branch of Unit 731, and like 5,000 people at least I know from records have died there. And so then like one of the very contested like thing about how many people actually died at Unit 731, we don't know. But even if a small branch in Singapore, like 5,000 people died there, I think there has to be more people that died in like Unit 731 than we think, because how they counted their human experimentation, they started from like 0 to 1,000, and then they start again from a 0 to 1,000. And so you never really know the true number of like the true scale. And also when the Soviet Union was coming to Manchuria and to Pink Farm, they actually like dynamited the whole thing. So it's like very hard to know if the whole buildings were crumbling, and like there were like all these like animals that were coming out because they were also doing experimentations on like some animals as well. Yeah, it was a big scale of things.
Yeah, and like every time we post about any kind of atrocities, well, committed by the Germans, Japanese, whatever, but specifically about the Japanese, I unlocked this world last July when I came back from Korea, and when we interviewed Jinbi Chen, and I posted like very hard. I made really hard posts about Japanese before interviewing her. You can also check out that episode, by the way. She's a survivor. It was a very, very powerful episode to us and to her, I think. But anyways, um, we had a lot of deniers in the comments. I unlocked this new world of deniers from Japan and from other places of the world, but specifically Japan. How do you like? So my question is like, and how much trouble do you put yourself when talking about that on the internet? Like how deep it goes?
Oh, I just block all the trolls. I'm tired. I don't want to engage. My time is better spent reading a book. Um Probably a lot of comments, but also like why not, I mean, if you're going to upload this on YouTube, an engagement is an engagement, and is actually good for your channel. YouTube is going to think that this is a very hopping video with a lot of community engagement. So feel free to leave a comment today when you're watching this video. And if you
I
made
never
it this
block.
far, please subscribe. Please subscribe.
Please subscribe. I never block anyone. I think like unless it is like pretty bad. But I engage with these guys, I debate with them until they're like 20, 30 comments in. I'm like, nice, dude. Thank you for your engagement. And I never answer them again. They tend to block me and delete everything they said. I'm like, okay, cool. It's a victory is a victory anyways. But they get really pissed. Got
A
really
win
pissed
is
with
a
me. Yeah.
win.
A win is a win, whatever. Yeah, and as we move towards the end of our interview here, for the younger generations who are learning about this is very important because here on internet we have a lot of young people and they are watching. This is one of the reasons I do this, and I bring people like you to talk about the reality of those events. So we have a lot of young people around here on the internet watching what we produce, what we make, what we put out there. What do you think is the most important lesson we can learn from Unit 731? And I want to highlight some words like the lessons about like science, war, and human responsibility, like for, from ourselves to the world, to the people around us.
Yeah, I think, science and ethics definitely is one of the lesson, and also it's responsibility doesn't really end when the war ends. Like after the atrocities, after the war, like societies need to decide to expose the truth or to bury it. Like the investigators, should they have expose what was happening instead of burying it and giving every bad guy an immunity deal and paying off to get like data, and also like to protect the victims or to like protect reputation, and also to teach the next generation, um like what to do, or like what is the right thing to do, versus like leaving them with silence. And also like, especially nowadays, I think on the internet, everyone is now an expert in geopolitics. Everyone is a doctor. Everyone is a lawyer. Everyone is like debating with each subject. But like, I think we need to figure out like there needs to be like baseline of like ethics. And once that ethics is crossed, like we shouldn't even argue about like what is a genocide, what is like atrocity, right? Like there should be a baseline of this. And so yeah, and in all, I think it's like this whole like unit 731 and also like its subsidiary is not just like a story about wartime cruelty, it's also like a story about secrecy and science and empire and choices to be made after a war. And like it also like I always have this question of like who gets justice, who gets forgotten, whose story gets to be decided to be told, and what happens when the government decides that some truth is just too useful to reveal. And so I think that's why we need to keep talking about it and we need to keep teaching it. And so then that's why it can't be stuck in the past, because we need to keep it alive so then we can actually build a future where we actually respect human lives and not treat it as like experimental material.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons I do this. I mean, I first I thought about my son, like what is he going to watch in the future? So I wanted to bring specialists together in a show where they can talk for hours and hours and hours and episodes about these topics. And especially this is something I want to leave to my audience listening to this. I also do this from the bottom of my heart for the victims who we need to remember the most in these cases, I believe, because what is done, it's done. The harm is already done, and they are gone, and they can speak for themselves. So we have all these, sorry, but these assholes out there saying it didn't happen when people were tortured, right? They were put under horrifying conditions, the conditions we can't even conceive in our minds, sitting in our chairs in our very comfortable places nowadays. And as I move down and down and down this hole called World War II, it never stops impressing me on how human cruelty can like be really real. That's the
Oh
thing. It
yeah.
feels real when you talk to the people who were there. When you read the letters and you have the things they had, the things they used, and you see, and it's not only the victims of the Holocaust or the Japanese. Also, I like to tell the stories of the young men of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, of the men who were in those bombers and those crazy situations. But anyways, we do also for them. I do it also for them. For this is a place I think they have a voice somehow. Through my posts, through my friends and the people who I bring here. Me and Samuel. Samuel speaks a lot for victims. He writes books about them and everything. So Yeah. Jenny, again, thank you very much for dedicating your time to us one more time. I want to have you once again here for another talk about comfort women, because I think this is well, in my opinion, with the amount of information I know, the pinnacle of human cruelty.
Yeah, I
Comfort
think
women to
we
me is
should
like,
do it because I actually went to Dallas recently and they were establishing a memorial for Grandma Lee, and I think it was a very powerful memorial that I went to. So yeah, we should definitely do an episode on that.
oh yeah, we're going to talk about that for sure in the future. Do you want to say anything else? Any final words for us tonight?
Please subscribe to this channel and also, you know, also follow you on Instagram. Also dubbed up to World War II Daily.
Don't forget that all the links, I'll put this at the beginning of the episode as well. All the links we discussed here will be in the description of this episode. You're going to find Jenny's Instagram, the Pacific Atrocities .edu,
dot org.
um,
Dot org.
or .org. Yeah. So we're going to find the link here in the description of this episode. You're going to find her Instagram all around my Instagram. We collab a lot, and I usually share her Instagram on my stories at least once a month, at least, but sometimes more than
Yeah.
that. So yeah, don't forget to subscribe and support. Again, this is what you can do for us for free, right? It doesn't cost you a single penny, and you can always unsubscribe and unfollow whatever if you don't like us anymore. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. If you came all the way to the end of this episode, again, subscribe. Please check out our Instagram. Links in the description again, and we'll see you on the next one. And only God knows what it's going to be about. So, bye bye.